Good morning. Today is Thursday, April 30th, and you have an assessment today. Your objective is, I will create an assessment to demonstrate my knowledge of the North and the South from 1820 to 1860. So remember, the first thing you're going to be reading about in section 1 was about the industrialization of the North. And remember, there are 3 phases of industrialization. You can ask questions about that. The different changes in transportation, the improvement in canals and trains, and improvement on roads. Big time was railroads. Definitely made a big difference. And it transformed how goods and people moved from one part of the country to the other. But we all know anytime there's progress, if there's something new, there's going to be other issues. You can write questions about what the problems were with this new progress and the new railroads, etc. At this time, as you guys read, you learned that there was new communication, such as the Morse code. You could write a question about Samuel Morse. You could do matching with him. We also know that there were farming innovations. For instance, we know that Cypress McCormick, came up with the mechanical reaper that made harvesting wheat so much quicker and so much faster. John Deere, we know about how he improved the plow. It was made of wood. He put a steel tip on it, and they could then sod bust out there in the prairies, and they could use that land for farming for the first time. The second part of this section, chapter 14, was factories. We know that factories started in the North and they pretty much stayed in the North. We know the condition wasn't really good for the factory workers. They worked over 11-hour days. They had women, children, all working. Some of the children were working 6 days a week, 12-hour days. We know the men were paid twice as much as women. Women made about half of what a man did, and the children even made less than that. And they used sometimes the children in the most difficult places that they could actually get injured even more than the other workers. The skilled workers, the people who had a specific job and had to have a skill, actually started trade unions. And one of their things was to go on strike, but we know that the business owners didn't like that, and they fired many of them at the beginning when they were using strikes. We know that there were African Americans, there were some freed African Americans, there were some escaped slaves. They were treated very poorly up north. There was so much prejudice. They weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to use public services or get a public education. We know that women were working. For instance, the Lowell female, they were working at the Lowell factory. And we know that Sarah G. Bagley from Massachusetts actually started the Lowell Female Labor Reform Organization, and they petitioned for a 10-hour day. Today, we would never think that people would be working, and that would be a good thing to have a 10-hour day, because most people work 8 to 9 hours now. We know that there was major immigration during this time period. And with this immigration, the Europeans were coming in through Ellis Island in New York, and the population of the New England and New York and the middle states was tremendous. And these large cities got bigger and bigger because there were jobs with factories. And the new immigrants took these jobs. They were low paying, but they could get a job, and they had to be able to make enough money to feed their families. We know that there was an increased immigration from Ireland because of the Great Potato Famine. We know that Ireland was producing potatoes, and when they had it's called blight, the potatoes grow underground, they're bulbs, and there was an issue and they started molding. And so the English said, no, you're not going to feed yourself. We're taking these, you owe them to us. And they took their potatoes. So about 1 million people passed away. They died of starvation in Ireland. At the same time, these same people were like, okay, we can either stay here and die, or we can go to America. And so about 1.5 million people, 1.5 million, came to America during this time period from 1846 to 1860. What was the impact? Well, the most recent immigrants, because there were the Irish were the number one immigrants at this time, and Germany was the second. The Irish had great prejudice against them. And there was a group of people they were called themselves nativist, and they were very concerned. They said, "Oh, well, all these new immigrants are going to bring crime and disease, and they're going to take our jobs, and they're going to work for less wages, and so they're going to take our jobs." And so there's a group that were nativist and wanted only Americans born here to get jobs and to be able to come in. They started a party called the Know Nothing Party, because when they said, "Hey, what's going on in there?" "Oh, I know nothing." They later became known as the American Party, excuse me, in 1854. Okay, then you learned about, in lesson 3, about the South. Up until this time period, in the early 1800s, there was some cotton growing in the South, but most of the things they were growing was indigo. They were growing tobacco, sugarcane. But cotton was very labor intensive. It was expensive to have to, water, and then it was very expensive to pick because you had to have so much labor. And then it took such an amazing amount of labor because you had to pick out every seed. Like I said before, the cotton was like this. It was kind of like a rose petal. And as it matures, it opens up, and then the cotton is right here in the middle. And then the slaves would come by, pick it up, and it was very scratchy, and it hurt their hands, made them bleed. And then they would put it in a bag, and then they would have to go through and pick every little tiny seed. Like if you've ever opened up a green pepper, the seeds inside, could you imagine picking every one of those out by hand for hundreds of pounds of cotton per day? So anyway, it was very time productive. So they weren't growing a lot of cotton. But Eli Whitney, we've heard of him before, he's an inventor. He came up with this thing called the cotton gin, and they could take this cotton gin right out into the field. It's a little box, and it would actually sort and get rid of all the seeds. Now you would take the cotton, pick it, stick it in there, mesh it down. The seeds would come out. You would take the cotton and you'd stick it in your bag. It was so much better because it saved so much time. And so people started growing more and more cotton. Now, at the same time, about the same time, in 1808, the United States made it illegal to import or bring slaves in from Africa or any other country. Any slave that was still living here was still a slave. And if your mom was a slave, you were a slave. So if they're going to be growing more cotton and it's more labor intensive than all the other crops, they're going to need those slaves even more than they did before. So now the slaves get more expensive because you can't just bring more in. And so they became more important. And the cost of each slave got more and more, got higher and higher. The Southern people were never really said, "Hey, industry's good." They are very agricultural. Most people in the South in some way had something to do with farming, agriculture. Some were big farmers and owned plantations. And then there were people that were like yeomans, and they owned small farms from 50 to 200 acres. They may or may not have any slaves at all. There were very few people had more than 100 slaves. When we think of the South, we think of huge plantations with hundreds of slaves. That wasn't the norm. There were the plantation owners that usually had slaves, and could be hundreds or 200 slaves, 300 slaves at a time. Then there were the yeomen who may have 1 or 2 slaves, a few, maybe 20, if they had a big plot of land. And then there were the tenant farmers. The tenant farmers were not much better off than the slaves because they basically rented space on a plantation. They planted, they did all the work, and then they had to give much of their profit to the plantation owner. So they were working almost for free. But the difference between the tenant farmer and a slave is the tenant farmer had that choice. They could go north, they could go wherever they wanted, they could plant, they didn't have to plant. They weren't owned by anyone. And they had freedoms, whereas the slaves had no freedom. They had to do whatever was told by the plantation owner. They lost all freedoms. The plantation owners were big business, and many of the plantation owners traveled a lot, which meant that they had to leave somebody in charge. A lot of times they would have what they call an overseer. The overseer was responsible for making the slaves work and getting the most out of each one of the slaves, so they would get the most work. A lot of times they were not very nice. They beat the slaves. They did whatever they had to, because if they didn't make the slaves produce, then they were going to get fired, and their families were going to starve to death. The lives of the enslaved people, we know it was a horrible, horrible existence. The African Americans that were enslaved in America, they lived in small little cabins, like little shacks without heat or air conditioning or fans or anything like that. They were given food. They were given medicine when they were sick, because remember, if a slave died, you just lost a bunch of money, because they were worth anywhere from $50 to $1,500 at that time. If you were a male that could do a trade, let's say you're a blacksmith, or you were a slave that could do a lot of work, you were a big 6'2" guy with big muscles, you might bring $1,500. A woman who was in good shape and between the ages of like 14 and 22 might also bring $1,500, because they would have the ability to bring new slaves in because they got pregnant. The baby was going to be your new slave. So men in good shape, young men in good shape, and young women in good shape were very expensive, and you could pay up to $1,500 for one slave. Now, if it was like a baby, they might only get $50 for a baby, or $50 for like a 3-year-old. The more work you could do, then the more that you would cost if they were buying you. The slaves, they had a life of their own. They had their own culture. They became very Christianized, and usually the plantation owner would have a church service every Sunday for them. That was the only day they didn't have to work, because they had to go to church. Now, what's interesting is the plantation owner would actually do the verses and stuff from the Bible, and he would actually tell them the Bible said that they were meant to be slaves and they should listen to the plantation owner because they were doing the right thing for them. Which, of course, remember, slaves couldn't read or write. It was illegal to teach a slave to read or write, so they couldn't read the Bible themselves, so they had to believe what they heard from the minister, who happened to be the plantation owner. The slaves would sing spirituals. Remember, they had a terrible existence. They're out there picking cotton for 12-hour days in the hot sun, very little food, very little water. So their lives were pretty miserable. So they would read about going to go to Jesus and go to heaven. And some of these spirituals actually ended up being ways for slaves to learn how to escape. A lot of these spirituals are still sang in churches today. There were slave codes. It told slaves what they could do and what they couldn't do. For instance, if you were a slave, you weren't allowed off the plantation unless you had a written note from the plantation owner. It was illegal for slaves to learn how to read and write. And they were allowed to, the owner could do whatever they wanted to you. They could beat you, they could kill you. You were property. You were their property, and there was no rights. It wasn't murder because you weren't a person. And one of the big things was they wouldn't let the enslaved people get together and gather in large groups, because they were afraid that if they did, especially on these big plantations with hundreds of slaves, if they were gathering and talking, they could then do an uprising. Because on the plantation, there might be 12, 15 white people, but there were hundreds of slaves. So if they actually did an uprising, they could kill the white people and take over. Now, of course, they would get caught because people would notice this. But there was, at one point, some people, like a guy named Nate Turner, he actually started a revolution. And in 1831, he led a group, a violent rampage in Virginia, and they killed at least 55 whites. Now, we know that that didn't last long. About 2 months later, after the uprising began, a group of people came and they killed Nate Turner, and they killed the other people. And then they ended up killing dozens of other people that had nothing to do with the Nate Turner Rebellion, just because they were African American. They killed them because they were angry. Some people did escape slavery, especially if you were living up in the northern part of the South. you could go across the Ohio River and you were safe once you got to Ohio. So there were people that were helping. There were groups of people that helped slaves escape called the Underground Railroad, which we talked about. It was a series of safe houses where if a slave could get to one of the safe houses, they would then keep the slave there. They would sleep all day, get fed, and get water. And then they would tell them where the next safe house was, and then they would send them the next night. And it was always traveling at night until they got north. Southern cities. There was not very much industrialization. It was mostly agriculture. And there weren't a lot of southern cities. The ones that did appear were on waterways because they didn't have a lot of trains. They only had about a third of the train tracks in the South. So they used waterways, some canals, mostly just rivers and tributaries to the rivers, like the Mississippi River. You could ask questions about what were some of these new cities like Chattanooga, Montgomery, and Atlanta. Atlanta ended up being a fairly big hub for industries and marketing and stuff like that until it gets burned down during the Civil War. But it's actually one of the only areas that is very industrialized, even in the South today. The South was not big on literacy or reading and writing. Up north, public education was a right. You could go to school. In the South, there was no public education. So if you wanted to become more literate, if you wanted to go to college, then if you lived on a plantation, then the plantation owner, depending on how many kids they had, might buy a tutor and have a tutor come live at the plantation and teach the kids. Sometimes plantation owners, if they were smaller, might have one tutor and then the kids would all go to one plantation to learn. Sometimes the overseer's kids would be allowed to go. But yeah, literacy wasn't as big in the South as it was up north. Believe me, there was a big difference. Okay, so with that quick review of what you should have read, remember you are making a 20-question test. You are creating 20 questions. They can be matching. They can be true and false. They can be multiple guess. You are writing the question and writing the answer. You are writing the answer and question in two different inks, ink and pencil, highlighting, whatever you want to do so that I can figure out what the answer is for your question. There's 20. These are due by Sunday at 11:59. Please don't wait till the last minute just in case something happens and your computer goes down or your internet goes down. Please get this done as soon as possible. And I will talk to you tomorrow. Bye.